In the business world, there are a lot of ways that we communicate. I'm Professor Regina Lee, and welcome to the Inside Scoop on Business Letters. Before you can ever put pen to paper or fingertips to keyboards, you have to understand what it is that you want to say. What is the purpose for your communication? Begin by identifying your role and your audience's role within that communication. To help you determine what your role is, ask yourself these 3 questions. What is your relationship to your audience? What is the purpose for writing the letter? And what action do you want your audience to take? Then look at your audience's role. From their perspective, what is their relationship to you? Will they want a formal or informal letter? And how willing will they be to respond to what it is that you are asking of them? Once you can identify these components on both sides of the scale, you can begin. Let's take a look at the basic components of a business letter. In the chapter Business Writing in Action, we were introduced to 15 elements of a letter. In this tutorial, I will tell you which are the most important elements to use because there really are only 11. Let's begin with the return address. Most return addresses are already pre-printed on the company letterhead, so if you will be using letterhead, there will be no need for you to add anything to this section. Next is the date. Keep in mind that this is typically the date that you will be sending the letter out. If you have taken a day or two to craft the letter, be sure to update the date as you go along. After the date, you have the inner or recipient's address. The most professional way to format the inner address is to use the person's first name and last name, the full street address including suite numbers and floor numbers when applicable, the city, state, and zip. I'll talk about titles and formatting in a minute. Next is the reference line or the regarding line. Like a subject line to an email, this is where you indicate what the letter is in reference to and the subject or purpose of the document. When creating a salutation or a greeting, think about your role to your audience. The role can mean the hierarchy or level of respect between the two of you, and it can also be based on how long you have known each other. Determining this will help you identify whether you should be using a formal or informal greeting. Next comes the content of your letter. The introduction establishes the purpose. The body articulates the message, and the conclusion reinstates the main points and may have a call to action. Like your greeting, your closing and signature lines are determined by your relationship to your audience and the formality of the communication. After your signature, you can indicate ENCL for enclosures, which means there are additional documents that will be delivered with this letter, or CC, which means courtesy copy. This indicates the relevant parties who will also receive a copy of the document. Next, you will want to think about centering your letter on the piece of paper. You will want to center it from top to bottom, which is your vertical centering, or horizontally, which is from left to right. You will also want to pay attention to your spacing between each of the components of your business letter. In the exercise, Create a Sales Appointment Letter, you are given a scenario and a letter and asked to determine what needs to be changed or corrected to make this a more professional business letter. Well, at first glance, it's easy to see that there is no punctuation in the letter. There are no spaces between the components, and if you look really closely, the roles are confused. Most people would start by addressing the punctuation and the spacing. But if you look at the roles first, it's going to be easier to identify where things need to go. Your role is John Timmons, the pharmaceutical sales rep, and your audience is Dr. Alexa Mercier. With those 2 things as our launching point, let's actually look at the letter and see what needs to be fixed. Now that we have established that you are John Timmons, let's take a look at the 14 Taylor Drive address and see what we need to do with that. Well, you are the sender of the letter, and the return address belongs to the sender. So let's move all that information up into the letterhead section of the letter. Next, let's look at the date. This particular date is void of any punctuation, So let's add a comma between the date and the year and move it up on the piece of paper so that we have more room for the body of our letter. Next, we have to create an inner address. Well, in this example, Dr. Mercier's address was in the body of the letter. But if we take it out of the body of the letter, we can then create the proper inner address and put it where it needs to go in order on the paper. Now, a title can be a Mr., a Mrs., a Miss, or a Ms. And in this particular case, it's Doctor. When using a title in the inner address, you will use the title, the first name, and the last name, as opposed to the greeting or the salutation, where you will only be using a title and a last name. Note that I took out the first name Alexa to create the proper greeting. And in this particular letter, there is no reference line. With all of that being done, it is important to know or remember the roles. You are John Timmons, the sender, and Dr. Mercier is the receiver. So Alexa would never be signing this letter. So let's take Alexa's name out and remove the thank you, since we're going to use critical thinking skills to craft a whole new letter. And in this letter, I am encouraging Dr. Alexa to meet with me because we've had promising results. I'm giving 2 times to meet and enticing her to meet with me by inviting her to lunch. And I also have a call to action at the end where I will call to confirm the date and the time that she has chosen. With the formality of this particular letter, I am going to choose a formal closing and a signature, and then sign it with my title underneath my name. With our message crafted and the letter components in proper place, now is the time to double check our writing mechanics. Start by making sure you have the proper single and double spacing. In a previous example, we had 4 spaces between the date and the inner address. In this particular letter, we can only have 2 spaces because we need more room on the letter for the longer message. Double check your comma placement. Look at your dates, your street address, the spaces between the city and the state, and even after your closing. It is always up to the writer to determine whether or not they wish to spell out the name of the state or use the 2-letter abbreviation. If you use the 2-letter abbreviation, make sure you capitalize both letters. And then finally, if there is important information in the body of your letter that you want to stand out, use bullet points, like we did in this particular case where we isolated the 2 dates and times we wish to meet with Dr. Mercier. With all of that in place, you will have a professional, polished letter. At the beginning of this tutorial, we mentioned that there are many ways to communicate in the business world. When it comes to business letters, we have to begin by identifying our purpose and our role. Why are we writing this communication, and what is our role or relationship to our audience or recipients? We also have to identify the main components of a business letter. We are the sender, so it is our address that creates the return address. The date is the date that the letter will actually be mailed out. The inner address belongs to our audience, who is the recipient. You can use a reference line to indicate what the main purpose of the document is, and our greeting is determined by the formality of our letter. The contents of the message include the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. And just like our greeting, the formality or informality of our letter will determine the proper closing and signature. Once all of that is in place, we want to double check our writing mechanics. Do we have good sentence structure? Are we using proper capitalization? Do we have proper capitalization or punctuation in place? We have to double check our spelling and be sure to reread all of your work to make sure that you have chosen the right words to communicate the right message. With all of that in place, you will have a professional business letter.